There is a strange reason Desperado should not work as well as it does. On paper, the story is almost aggressively familiar. A mysterious gunslinger arrives in a dangerous town, discovers a criminal empire, falls for a woman trapped inside that world, and begins tearing his way toward the man responsible for his suffering. It is essentially an old revenge western transported into the heat, color, music, and chaos of a 1990s Mexican action movie. And yet, instead of feeling like a collection of familiar ideas, Desperado feels like something that could only have been made by Robert Rodriguez. At the center of it all is El Mariachi, a musician who has gradually become something far more dangerous than the man he once was. The contradiction is immediate. A guitar once represented his future. Now the guitar case can conceal weapons. The same hands that were supposed to create music are being used to create violence. He is still a musician somewhere beneath the black clothes, the ammunition, and the reputation, but the world around him has transformed his identity. Antonio Banderas gives the character an extraordinary physical presence, yet what makes his performance work is that the charisma never completely erases the pain underneath it. He can walk into a room like a Western legend, but there is still something wounded in his silence. That tension defines the entire movie. The opening bar sequence makes the philosophy clear almost immediately. Rodriguez introduces a world where rumors become reality, where people are more frightened by a story than by the man standing in front of them, and where violence can be horrifying, ridiculous, and exhilarating within the same sequence. The guitar case becomes one of cinema's most recognizable weaponized objects because it is more than a clever action prop. It is the physical representation of El Mariachi's divided existence. It carries the memory of who he was and the tools of who he has become. Rodriguez also understands that action can have rhythm. Gunshots arrive like percussion. Movement becomes choreography. A sudden explosion can function almost like a musical beat, and a brutal confrontation can be followed by an absurd joke before the audience has fully processed what just happened. The movie is exaggerated, but it is never embarrassed by that exaggeration. It knows that it is creating a fantasy. At the same time, the emotional foundation remains surprisingly sincere. Beneath the explosions is a man attempting to turn pain into purpose. Revenge gives him somewhere to go because grief alone gives him nowhere. And then there is Carolina, whose presence introduces a possibility that El Mariachi has almost forgotten. Perhaps his life can contain something besides survival. Their relationship gives the film a second question. If revenge is the only thing keeping him alive, what happens when he finally has something worth living for? That is where Desperado becomes more interesting than stylish gunplay. The movie asks whether the Western hero can remain human after becoming a myth. It asks whether violence can restore identity or only replace one wound with another. And it asks whether love can interrupt a cycle that revenge seems determined to continue. To understand why those questions matter, we have to move beyond the plot and examine the strange combination of filmmaking philosophy, Western mythology, cultural imagery, music, romance, comedy, and practical action that gives Desperado its unmistakable identity. This is not simply a sequel in the conventional sense. It is an expansion of an idea. Rodriguez takes the world of El Mariachi and gives it greater scale without stripping away the rough personality that made the original so memorable. That distinction matters because Robert Rodriguez's career was built around the idea that limitations did not necessarily have to weaken a filmmaker. Sometimes limitations could force creativity. El Mariachi was famously made under extraordinary financial constraints, with Rodriguez handling multiple aspects of production and discovering solutions because expensive alternatives simply were not available. Desperado arrives after that experiment has attracted attention, but Rodriguez does not suddenly become a conventional studio director. Instead, he brings the mentality of an independent filmmaker into a much larger action movie. The difference can be felt in almost every frame. The movie moves quickly, trusts visual ideas, embraces practical effects, and refuses to behave as though genre boundaries are sacred. Rodriguez can shift from Western to crime thriller, from romance to comedy, from brutal action to comic book fantasy without stopping to explain the transition. That freedom becomes one of the movie's greatest strengths. The connection to El Mariachi is especially important because Desperado essentially rebuilds the character for a larger audience. The original El Mariachi had a different performer, a different scale, and a much more constrained production environment. Here, Antonio Banderas steps into the role and turns the character into a star vehicle without losing the essential idea of the wandering musician. Banderas is not simply playing a replacement version of the earlier hero. He is playing a mythologized evolution of him. The character has become harder, more confident, and more physically imposing, but the emotional wound remains. Salma Hayek's Carolina provides the counterweight. She is not simply placed in the story as a romantic prize waiting at the end of a revenge mission. She becomes the person through whom El Mariachi begins to imagine a different life. Their chemistry is crucial because the movie needs an emotional center strong enough to survive the ridiculousness surrounding it. Steve Buscemi's opening presence performs another important function. He is effectively a storyteller inside the story, someone whose account of the mysterious gunslinger helps transform El Mariachi from an ordinary man into a legend before the audience fully understands him. Cheech Marin contributes another layer through comedy, while Danny Trejo brings the physical menace of a figure who looks as though he could have walked directly out of a dark Western nightmare. Joaquim de Almeida's Butcho completes the opposing side of the mythology. He is not merely a criminal boss with a large organization. He is eventually revealed as someone whose connection to El Mariachi makes the conflict deeply personal. All of these elements become part of Rodriguez's larger filmmaking philosophy. Give the audience something recognizable, then push it far enough that it becomes yours. That approach was especially striking in the mid-1990s. Hollywood action cinema was dominated by enormous personalities, muscular heroes, increasingly elaborate explosions, crime thrillers, and polished studio machinery. Audiences knew what an action star was supposed to look like. Schwarzenegger, Stallone, Van Damme, and other major stars had established a visual vocabulary built around physical power, one-liners, impossible survival, and increasingly large-scale spectacle. Desperado enters that landscape but does not quite belong to it. Its hero is charismatic, but his charisma comes from mystery rather than speeches. Setting feels different. Its music feels different. Its humor feels different. Its romance is more central than the typical action formula suggests. And its Mexican environment is not merely a backdrop for an American hero. It becomes part of the movie's mythology and visual personality. That distinction helped make the film feel fresh, even though its basic revenge structure was ancient. Marketing could sell gunfire, Banderas, explosions, and the promise of another wild action movie. But the emotional center was quieter. This was ultimately a story about a man who had lost part of himself and was trying to decide what remained. For audiences raised on the increasingly polished blockbusters that followed, Desperado can feel like a reminder of another kind of cinematic energy. It comes from a period when filmmakers could still make action movies that felt visibly personal. You can see the director's personality in the framing, the jokes, the music, the absurd weapons, the pacing, and the willingness to let a single visual idea dominate an entire sequence. The practical nature of the action also contributes to that feeling. Modern audiences are accustomed to digital environments and increasingly invisible visual effects, but Desperado often feels physical. Objects break. Bodies react. Guns have weight. Performers move through real spaces. The movie's exaggeration is obvious, yet that physicality gives the fantasy texture. The guitar case weapon concept alone has survived because it is instantly understandable. It is funny before anyone even opens the case, and once the weapons appear, the joke becomes part of the character's mythology. Banderas is equally important to the movie's lasting appeal. He possesses the kind of charisma that makes silence feel like dialogue. He can be romantic without losing danger and dangerous without becoming completely cold. Salma Hayek's breakthrough performance adds another reason the film remains culturally significant. Her Carolina gives the movie warmth, intelligence, vulnerability, and agency within a world that could otherwise become emotionally exhausting. Younger viewers may encounter Desperado through an isolated action clip, a meme, a guitar case reference, or an action compilation and initially assume they are looking at another exaggerated 1990s shootout movie. But understanding the film in its full context reveals something more interesting. Desperado sits at an important transition point between independent filmmaking and studio genre cinema, between traditional Western mythology and modern action spectacle, between the charismatic action hero of the past and the more personality-driven genre filmmakers who would become increasingly important. That is why missing the movie means missing part of the story of how 1990s cinema changed. And once the context is clear, the story itself becomes even more revealing. The film begins not with El Mariachi explaining who he is, but with other people explaining who they think he is. That distinction is crucial. The legend arrives before the man. A stranger enters a bar carrying a guitar case, and the people around him have already heard stories about someone like him. The rumors describe a figure who moves from town to town, carrying an instrument that may contain something much more dangerous. The story is already becoming larger than reality. Steve Buscemi's character functions almost like a narrator inside this mythology, telling people what to fear while simultaneously increasing the audience's curiosity. When El Mariachi finally enters the world of the film, the expectation has already been established. He is not simply another traveler. He is a question. What happened to this man? Why is he carrying weapons? And why does the world seem to know his reputation before it knows his name? The answer is tied to the events of El Mariachi's past. He was once a musician, someone traveling with the simple ambition of finding work and playing music. Violence changed that trajectory. He lost people, lost part of himself, and emerged from the experience carrying a new identity. His guitar is still there, but the meaning of the guitar has changed. The object that once represented art now represents danger. This is one of Rodriguez's smartest recurring ideas. Transformation does not always mean throwing away the past. Sometimes the past is forced to coexist with the new identity. The bar sequence turns that idea into action. El Mariachi walks into an environment where criminal power is treated casually, and the tension rises because the audience knows more than many of the characters. His appearance creates confusion because the criminal organization is searching for someone who matches a description. The mistaken identity becomes a narrative engine. Butcho's men believe they know what kind of person they are hunting, but their certainty becomes their weakness. El Mariachi's reputation begins working against them. The more they hear about the mysterious gunman, the more they fear him, and the more fear magnifies his legend. This is how Rodriguez builds a hero who is almost supernatural without actually making him supernatural. The audience sees that he is skilled, but the story repeatedly allows other characters to exaggerate that skill. Myth becomes a weapon. Carolina enters this mythology from a different position. Her bookstore and cafe provide a space that initially feels removed from the violence surrounding Butcho's organization. Books suggest knowledge, reflection, and escape, while the streets outside are dominated by guns and fear. Carolina herself is caught between those worlds. Her connection to Butcho means she is not completely outside the criminal system, but her emotional distance from it makes her a potential doorway into another life for El Mariachi. Their first interactions are shaped by caution. He is injured and suspicious. She is curious but aware of the danger surrounding him. Neither knows whether trust is possible. That hesitation gives their relationship more weight than a simple action movie romance. They are both people surrounded by circumstances they did not fully choose. As El Mariachi's injuries are discovered and Carolina begins helping him, the film slows just enough to remind us that the man beneath the legend is vulnerable. He is not an unstoppable machine. He bleeds. He remembers. He hesitates. He has lost something that cannot simply be replaced by a larger gun. Carolina becomes a temporary sanctuary. And that sanctuary matters because the story is constantly asking whether a person defined by violence can still find a place where violence does not control him. But Butcho's organization keeps closing in. His men are searching for the mysterious gunman, and every encounter increases the pressure. El Mariachi's initial instinct is survival, but escape gradually becomes impossible. The rumors have already trapped him inside the legend. Once Butcho knows that a dangerous stranger is moving through his territory, there is no neutral ground left. El Mariachi therefore makes a decision. Instead of running forever, he will confront the source of the threat. This is the moment when the wandering survivor becomes an active hunter. Carolina's involvement makes that decision more complicated. Revenge is no longer only about what happened in the past. Now there is someone in the present whose life is connected to his choices. Their attraction develops in the space between danger and trust, and that contrast gives the movie an emotional pulse that prevents the violence from becoming completely empty. Crossing into Butcho's territory therefore becomes more than a tactical decision. It is the moment El Mariachi accepts that his past cannot simply be outrun. He must enter the world that created the man he has become. From here Desperado accelerates. El Mariachi moves through Butcho's criminal network with increasing confidence, and Rodriguez uses every confrontation to reveal another part of his character. The action is deliberately excessive. Guitar cases contain weapons. Gunmen appear from unexpected places. Barrooms become battlefields. Streets turn into shooting galleries. The choreography feels less concerned with realistic military tactics than with creating visual rhythm. El Mariachi improvises because improvisation fits the mythology of the musician. He is not a soldier following a plan. He is a performer reacting to the moment. That makes his fighting style feel connected to his original identity. He moves with timing. He reads space. He turns objects into instruments. Even when the movie is at its most ridiculous, there is a logic beneath the spectacle. Rodriguez wants the violence to feel like an extension of personality. Carolina becomes increasingly involved rather than remaining safely outside the action. Her transformation from observer to participant parallels El Mariachi's own transformation. She sees what he is capable of, but she also sees the wounded person underneath it. Their attraction becomes stronger precisely because both understand the danger of the world surrounding them. Meanwhile, Butcho's attempts to identify and eliminate the threat become increasingly desperate. Assassins such as Navajas add to the feeling that El Mariachi is moving through a maze of increasingly exaggerated killers. The mistaken identities continue to complicate the situation, and the protagonist's reputation grows with every confrontation. By this point, the legend has almost overtaken the man. People do not simply react to El Mariachi's actions. They react to the story they have heard about him. That is why the contrast between musician and killer becomes increasingly important. Every gunfight raises the question of what remains of the person who once wanted nothing more than to play music. Revenge may have given him direction, but it has also made violence feel normal. The danger is no longer simply that Butcho might kill him. The deeper danger is that El Mariachi might become entirely defined by killing. The emotional stakes therefore rise alongside the body count. Carolina is no longer simply someone he wants to protect. She represents the possibility of another identity. If he chooses her, he must imagine a future. If he chooses revenge completely, he risks remaining trapped in the past. And then the story delivers its most important revelation. Butcho is not simply another criminal standing at the end of the road. His relationship to El Mariachi changes the meaning of everything that came before. The hero versus villain structure begins to collapse because the conflict is now connected to family, betrayal, and identity. The enemy is not merely external. He is tied to the protagonist's own history. That revelation shocks El Mariachi because it transforms revenge from a simple mission into a confrontation with a corrupted version of belonging. Butcho's power has been built on control, but beneath that power is fear. He has spent years constructing an organization that allows him to control other people. Yet the arrival of El Mariachi proves that the past cannot always be controlled. Butcho can command men, money, and territory, but he cannot command the meaning of what happened between them. His attempts to rationalize his actions reveal a person who desperately wants violence to have been necessary. That is what makes him dangerous, but it also makes him tragic in a distorted way. He cannot escape the choices that created his power. Carolina is caught between these two men, but the real conflict is not simply over who will survive. It is over which identity will define the future. El Mariachi has been living as though revenge can restore what was taken from him. Yet the midpoint revelation forces him to confront the uncomfortable possibility that no amount of violence can reverse the past. Killing Butcho may remove the person responsible, but it cannot return what was lost. This is the emotional low point of the story because the purpose behind the revenge begins to weaken. What happens when revenge succeeds? What remains afterward? For a wounded survivor, that question can be more frightening than death itself. And yet, this is also where El Mariachi begins to change. Earlier violence happened to him. Now he chooses how to respond. He is no longer simply reacting to trauma. He is deliberately deciding what kind of man he will be after it. That distinction prepares the story for its final act. The assault on Butcho's world is not simply another sequence of increasingly large gunfights. It is the physical expression of a psychological decision. El Mariachi is going to confront Butcho, but he is no longer fighting only to punish the past. He is fighting to prevent Butcho's worldview from becoming his own future. Carolina chooses to stand beside him, and that choice matters because it confirms that El Mariachi does not have to walk into the final confrontation completely alone. The Western hero traditionally rides into town alone, solves the problem through violence, and rides away. Desperado plays with that formula. El Mariachi may look like the solitary gunslinger, but the possibility of connection has changed what solitude means. The final confrontation with Butcho, therefore, carries emotional weight beyond its tactical outcome. Butcho represents power through control, fear, and corruption. El Mariachi represents freedom through movement, individuality, and the possibility of choosing something different. Their conflict is inevitable because both men are connected to the same past, but have responded to it differently. Butcho built an empire. El Mariachi became a wanderer. One tried to control the world. The other learned to survive by refusing to belong to it. When Butcho dies, the significance is not simply that another villain has been eliminated. A particular version of El Mariachi's past has also been destroyed. The family revelation makes the death more complicated, because the victory cannot be celebrated without acknowledging what it cost. Yet El Mariachi refuses to inherit Butcho's worldview. He does not take over the empire. He does not become another criminal king. Instead, he leaves. That choice is crucial. In a story built around revenge, the most important act may be refusing to continue the cycle after revenge has been completed. Carolina survives, and the possibility of a shared future remains open. But the ending does not pretend that El Mariachi has been magically healed. He still carries the scars of what happened. He still carries the guitar. He still carries weapons. His future is therefore ambiguous. The road ahead may represent freedom, but it may also represent continued exile. The Western tradition thrives on that uncertainty. The gunslinger rides away because he belongs nowhere and everywhere. El Mariachi becomes a modern version of that figure, a man whose legend will continue traveling even after he has left the town behind. The guitar remains the perfect symbol of that transformation. It can be an instrument, can be a weapon. It can represent the past while carrying the future. El Mariachi has not become someone completely different. He has become someone forced to carry contradictions. That makes him one of the more interesting action heroes of his era. On the surface, his goal is revenge. Beneath that is something more complicated. He wants to recover control over his own identity. Trauma has taken choices away from him, and violence becomes his attempt to reclaim them. Yet the problem with violence is that it can create another prison. Every time he kills someone, he becomes more closely associated with the identity the world has given him. The musician begins disappearing behind the gunslinger. His lost hand carries an especially powerful symbolic meaning, because it represents the physical consequences of a life changed by violence. The injury is not just a piece of backstory. It is proof that the body remembers what the mind tries to transform into legend. The myth says El Mariachi is unstoppable. The body says otherwise. He has limitations. He has scars. He has already paid for the identity he carries. Music therefore becomes the ghost of his former self. The guitar reminds us that before he became a gunslinger, he wanted to create something rather than destroy something. That distinction makes the character's violence morally complicated. He is not an innocent man who never hurts anyone. He kills. He participates in the cycle. But the film refuses to make him completely comfortable inside that identity. His emotional repression is part of the classic Western tradition. The gunslinger does not explain his feelings. He communicates through movement, silence, and action. But Desperado adds another layer by placing that archetype inside a story about trauma. El Mariachi is emotionally restrained not because he has no feelings, but because expressing them would force him to confront what happened. Carolina challenges that repression. Her relationship with him creates a space where he can briefly be more than a legend. She sees the man instead of the rumor. That is why their romance matters. Love does not erase the violence, but it gives him an alternative to isolation. The distinction between vengeance and justice also becomes important. Justice implies restoration or moral balance. Revenge is personal. El Mariachi begins with revenge because he wants someone to suffer for what happened to him. But by the end, the more meaningful question is whether he can stop allowing the past to dictate every future decision. His final acceptance of himself does not mean embracing violence without question. It means accepting that the musician and the gunslinger are both parts of his history. He cannot return to the person he was before the trauma. He can only decide what to do with the person he became. Butcho provides the dark alternative. He is more than a crime boss because he represents what happens when survival becomes control. His empire is built on organization, fear, and paranoia. Where El Mariachi moves freely, Butcho is trapped by the system he created. He has men everywhere, yet he trusts almost no one. He possesses territory, yet he is haunted by the possibility of losing it. He has power, yet the arrival of one wandering musician destabilizes everything. That contradiction makes Butcho an effective mirror. El Mariachi has very little material power but enormous individual freedom. Butcho has enormous material power but almost no psychological freedom. The more he tries to control the world, the more obvious his fear becomes. His relationship with his men reinforces that idea. They are extensions of his authority, but they are also reminders that his power depends on constant enforcement. He cannot simply exist without commanding. El Mariachi, meanwhile, can walk away. That is why Butcho fears him. The gunslinger does not need Butcho's system to survive. Butcho needs his system to feel safe. Their personal connection makes this contrast even more painful. Butcho represents corrupted family, loyalty twisted into ownership, and a past that refuses to remain buried. His attempts to justify himself reveal moral cowardice beneath physical authority. He wants to believe that circumstances made him what he is because admitting choice would mean accepting responsibility. In that sense, he is the opposite of El Mariachi's final realization. El Mariachi accepts that he has become violent, but still believes he can choose what happens next. Butcho believes the violence must continue because it is the only world he knows. His final confrontation therefore feels personal because the two men are not simply fighting over territory. They are fighting over the meaning of their shared past. The supporting cast makes that central conflict possible, because Desperado's world is unusually populated for a story about a lone hero. Carolina provides emotional grounding. Buscemi provides mythology. Cheech Marin provides comic relief. Danny Trejo provides physical menace. Navajas becomes a recurring symbol of the assassins surrounding Butcho's empire. Campa and Quino contribute to the sense that El Mariachi's journey is part of a larger network of musicians, fighters, and storytellers. These characters keep the movie from becoming tonally flat. Comedy is particularly important because the violence is so extreme. Without humor, the film could become exhausting. With humor, Rodriguez creates distance between the audience and the brutality, allowing the action to operate as stylized entertainment while still retaining emotional consequences. The supporting characters also help establish the movie's mythology. Everyone seems to know a version of the mariachi story. Everyone contributes another piece to the legend. The audience therefore experiences El Mariachi in two forms simultaneously: as a human being and as a story other people are telling. That distinction leads directly into the film's deeper themes. At its core, Desperado is about identity under pressure. Trauma forces people to adapt, but adaptation can become another form of captivity. El Mariachi survives by becoming more violent, yet that violence threatens to erase the person he used to be. Revenge gives him a purpose, but it is a purpose built around the past. The movie repeatedly asks whether becoming the thing that hurt you can ever create genuine freedom. The answer is complicated because violence is not portrayed as meaningless. It saves him. It protects Carolina. It allows him to survive Butcho's world. But usefulness does not automatically make something healthy. The film's action is exciting precisely because it is stylized. But beneath that spectacle is a cycle that keeps demanding another victim. Love offers a possible interruption. Carolina represents the future because she is connected to El Mariachi's present rather than his past. She does not ask him to pretend that the violence never happened. Instead, her presence suggests that he can become more than the violence. Isolation is therefore contrasted with connection. The Western gunslinger traditionally gains freedom by leaving society behind, but Desperado asks whether freedom without human connection is really freedom at all. The film also explores masculinity through silence. El Mariachi rarely explains his pain, and his physical competence becomes a substitute for emotional expression. He can shoot faster than he can speak about what happened to him. That is a familiar action hero pattern. But Rodriguez gives it a melancholy edge. The hero's silence is not simply cool. It is evidence of damage. The myth says strength means never showing weakness. The human being underneath the myth knows that weakness is part of being alive. Family corruption adds another dimension. Butcho's connection to El Mariachi turns the criminal world into something more intimate. The threat is no longer just an external organization. It has entered the protagonist's understanding of family and loyalty. That is why revenge cannot simply restore the old world. The old world is gone. The hero must build a new one. Visually, Rodriguez expresses these ideas through objects and spaces. The guitar is the most obvious symbol. It represents art, identity, memory, and eventually violence. The guitar case transforms that symbolism into something physical. A case designed to protect an instrument becomes a container for weapons. The transformation is funny, but it is also tragic. Art has been converted into an instrument of survival. Black clothing reinforces the gunslinger mythology. El Mariachi becomes a silhouette, a recognizable shape that can be identified before his face is even visible. Blood functions in two ways at once. It is consequence, but it is also spectacle. Rodriguez uses it to remind us that action movies often transform violence into visual entertainment. The film knows that contradiction and embraces it. Bars become spaces where danger can erupt without warning. Carolina's bookstore functions almost like the opposite. Books suggest stories, knowledge, memory, and imagination. The road connects both worlds. It is the space of the wandering hero, always promising movement but never guaranteeing belonging. Shadows and silhouettes turn characters into icons. Mirrors and reflections reinforce questions about identity. Who is El Mariachi when nobody is watching? Is he the musician, the killer, the lover, or the legend? The answer keeps changing depending on who is looking. Even the movie's exaggerated color and composition contribute to its symbolic language. Darkness creates mystery. Red becomes associated with violence and passion. Movement becomes a form of storytelling. Rodriguez rarely treats visual exaggeration as an accident. It is part of the film's philosophy. Desperado is not trying to reproduce reality. It is creating a heightened reality where the rules of the Western, action movie, comic book, and romantic melodrama can coexist. This is why the film works best when understood as a modern myth disguised as an action movie. The Western has always been one of America's foundational cinematic mythologies. The lone figure arrives, confronts corruption, survives violence, and rides away. Rodriguez takes that structure and relocates it into a world shaped by Mexican imagery, Latin music, Spanish language, religious references, urban crime, and comic book action. El Mariachi becomes a wandering gunslinger, whose weapon is inseparable from his identity as a musician. The movie is therefore not merely borrowing the Western. It is translating the Western into another cultural and cinematic vocabulary. Storytelling itself becomes part of the myth. Buscemi's character describes the legend. Other characters react to rumors. Each retelling makes El Mariachi larger. The interesting part is that the audience eventually understands that the legend and the man are not the same thing. Reputation is powerful precisely because people believe it. The more Butcho's men fear the story, the more the story controls them. El Mariachi's greatest weapon may therefore be the imagination of his enemies. This is also why masculinity and emotional silence matter. The Western hero is traditionally defined by what he does rather than what he says. Rodriguez preserves that tradition while exposing its emotional cost. The hero becomes a myth because he does not explain himself, but the audience is invited to look beneath the silence and see the pain. The relationship between art and violence is perhaps the most distinctive symbolic tension in the movie. Music creates. Guns destroy. Yet the same character carries both. The movie never fully resolves the contradiction because it is part of El Mariachi's identity. He cannot return to innocence, but he also does not have to surrender his connection to art. That ambiguity is what gives the guitar its power. The production itself reinforces these themes because Desperado is a live-action film whose spectacle depends heavily on physical filmmaking. Rodriguez's approach to action is practical, direct, and deliberately exaggerated. Gunfire effects, squibs, blood effects, stunts, explosions, and real locations give the movie a tactile quality. The camera is often close to the action, using wide-angle compositions and rapid movement to make spaces feel larger and more chaotic than they might actually be. Editing creates punctuation. Slow motion can isolate a moment of impact before the film accelerates again. The guitar case sequences demonstrate this perfectly. The cases are visually simple, but once opened they become mechanical jokes and action devices. Their importance comes from choreography. Rodriguez understands that an action scene is not only about what happens, but about how the audience experiences the sequence. A gun can be fired realistically and forgotten. A guitar case filled with weapons becomes an image. That is the difference between functional action and cinematic action. Desperado repeatedly chooses the image. Its violence is designed to be remembered. Practical production also allows limitations to become part of the film's personality. Rodriguez came from a filmmaking philosophy where solving problems creatively was not optional. It was the process. Even with greater studio resources, he retained the instinct to make choices quickly and efficiently. That gives the film a handmade quality beneath the polish. It does not feel anonymous. It feels authored. His directing style is inseparable from the movie because he combines camera experimentation, fast pacing, visual humor, genre references, music, romance, and action without allowing one element to completely dominate the others. The result is a movie that feels like someone is actively playing with the medium. This is particularly visible in the way Rodriguez trusts performers. Banderas is allowed to use physical comedy as well as menace. Hayek is given emotional material that prevents Carolina from becoming merely decorative. The supporting cast is encouraged to embrace the film's heightened tone. Even the collaboration with Quentin Tarantino contributes to the movie's unusual energy. Tarantino's presence and storytelling sensibility fit naturally into Rodriguez's willingness to mix violence, humor, dialogue, and genre mythology. But Rodriguez's identity remains distinct. He is not simply copying another filmmaker's style. He is absorbing influences and turning them into something personal. The same principle applies to music. Music is not background decoration in Desperado. It is part of El Mariachi's identity. The guitar-driven soundscape reminds us that the protagonist began as a musician. Latin influences help establish the cultural atmosphere, while reinforcing the Western foundation. Romantic cues soften the film's harder edges, while tension-building instrumentation prepares the audience for sudden violence. One of Rodriguez's most effective tricks is contrast. A calm melody can create anticipation precisely because the audience knows chaos is coming. A musical rhythm can align with editing so that action feels choreographed rather than random. Gunfights can almost become performances. That is appropriate because El Mariachi himself is a performer. He has simply been forced to change the kind of performance he gives. The soundtrack therefore becomes another bridge between his past and present. Sound design extends the same philosophy. Gunshots are not merely realistic sounds. They are rhythmic punctuation. Breaking glass, footsteps, impacts, voices, and environmental noise are carefully arranged to make the action feel larger than life. Silence becomes equally important. The moment before violence can be more powerful than the violence itself, because silence creates space for expectation. Bar ambience establishes a sense of crowded danger. Musical performances remind us of the world El Mariachi came from. Audio transitions connect emotional scenes to action scenes, allowing the movie to move between tones without completely losing its rhythm. This sonic identity is one reason the film remains recognizable, even when viewed decades later. The images may remind us of the 1990s, but the combination of guitar, gunfire, voices, and sudden silence still feels uniquely Desperado. When the film arrived in 1995, audiences encountered something familiar enough to understand but distinctive enough to stand apart. The movie offered the pleasures of an action spectacle, while introducing a director whose personality was impossible to ignore. Critics could discuss its style, action, performances, and humor, while audiences could simply enjoy the ride. Antonio Banderas emerged as a major presence because El Mariachi gave him an unusual combination of physical charisma and emotional mystery. He did not need to behave like the conventional American action star. His performance was rooted in a different kind of screen presence. Salma Hayek's performance also became an important part of the movie's legacy because Carolina gave the film an emotional center and helped establish Hayek as a major performer. Steve Buscemi's opening remains memorable because it turns exposition into storytelling. The movie understands that audiences enjoy being told a legend when the legend is entertaining enough. Quotable moments, outrageous action, and distinctive images helped the film develop a reputation that continued beyond its initial release. Over time, Desperado became a cult favorite partly because it represented a version of 1990s action cinema that was increasingly disappearing. It was polished enough to feel like a studio movie, but personal enough to retain the rough edges of independent filmmaking. Home video allowed audiences to revisit it, and later generations encountered its imagery through clips, references, and the larger Rodriguez filmography. Its connection to From Dusk Till Dawn and eventually Once Upon a Time in Mexico helped establish the idea of a Rodriguez cinematic universe where genre rules could be stretched almost indefinitely. The Mariachi trilogy also demonstrates how the character evolved. What began as a low-budget story became a larger mythology, and Desperado sits at the center of that transformation. Banderas's career continued to expand. Hayek became one of the most recognizable performers of her generation, and Rodriguez established himself as a filmmaker capable of moving between genres without abandoning his personality. The guitar case became a piece of pop culture shorthand. It could be referenced without explanation because audiences immediately understood the joke. That is a sign of lasting imagery. The film's cultural impact is therefore not limited to box office numbers or critical reviews. It exists in memory. People remember the black clothes, the guitar case, the bar, the music, the impossible gunfights, Banderas's presence, Hayek's performance, and the sense that the movie was having fun while taking its emotional core seriously. Yet the film's simplicity also creates a legitimate critical debate. Some viewers see the plotting as thin. Compared with modern films that construct elaborate universes, multiple character arcs, and intricate twists, Desperado's story can appear almost skeletal. The hero wants revenge. The villain controls a criminal empire. The woman becomes his ally and love interest. The final confrontation arrives. From one perspective, that simplicity is a weakness. There are supporting characters who are memorable more because of attitude than development. Some motivations are functional rather than deeply explored. The criminal world operates according to genre logic, rather than realistic social systems. But another interpretation is that the simplicity is intentional. Rodriguez is not primarily interested in constructing a complex crime saga. He is building a modern Western fantasy. The story is a framework for character, rhythm, action, music, and myth. In that context, the simplicity allows the movie to move. It does not have to stop every few minutes to explain itself. The audience understands the emotional objective, so the film can focus on execution. Both interpretations are valid. A viewer who prioritizes narrative complexity may find the plot limited. A viewer who values kinetic filmmaking and genre personality may consider that limitation part of the charm. This is why action movies often receive different critical standards from dramas. The question is not only whether the story is complicated, it is whether the film accomplishes what it is trying to accomplish. Desperado wants to create an exaggerated action western with emotional stakes, and it succeeds at that with remarkable consistency. Its criticisms also deserve attention. The violence is extreme, the body count is high, and the physics frequently operate according to comic book rules. Mexican settings and criminal culture are exaggerated into a stylized fantasy. Certain supporting characters function more as genre archetypes than as fully developed individuals. Gender representation can also be examined critically. Carolina has agency and participates in the story, but the film still places her within a romantic framework shaped by the male hero's journey. Her importance is real, yet some aspects of the genre framing remain rooted in the conventions of its era. The film's masculinity is similarly complicated. Strength is repeatedly associated with weapons, confidence, and physical control, while emotional vulnerability is often expressed indirectly. The movie can celebrate that mythology while simultaneously showing its consequences. Tonal inconsistency is another possible criticism. Desperado can move from graphic violence to absurd comedy so quickly that some viewers may feel emotionally disconnected. But again, this may be better understood as deliberate stylization than accidental inconsistency. Rodriguez is not trying to create realism. He is creating a heightened world where violence operates like comic book spectacle. Once that rule is accepted, the exaggeration becomes part of the film's identity. The important question is not whether the action is realistic. It is whether the fantasy has internal emotional logic. In Desperado, the physical world may be impossible, but the emotional conflict remains understandable. A wounded man wants revenge. A woman offers him another possibility. A powerful criminal is terrified of losing control. A past betrayal threatens to define the future. Those are human ideas even when the bullets fly in impossible directions. Commercially, Desperado also represents an important experiment. Rodriguez had moved from the microscopic scale of El Mariachi to a larger studio production, yet the movie still felt like his. That transition demonstrated that independent sensibility could survive within commercial filmmaking. The budget was larger, the cast was more recognizable, and the action was more ambitious, but the film's personality did not disappear. That is significant because Hollywood often absorbs distinctive filmmakers and smooths away their rough edges. Rodriguez resisted that process. The commercial value of the movie came partly from its accessibility. Audiences did not need to know El Mariachi to understand the basic story. The film could be marketed as an action spectacle, a romantic thriller, a western, or a star vehicle. That flexibility helped it travel internationally. At the same time, the distinctive Mexican setting and Latin-inflected atmosphere separated it from more generic American action movies. The success reinforced the idea that Rodriguez's personal style could be commercially viable. It also helped establish the mariachi mythology as a property that could continue. Once Upon a Time in Mexico would later complete the trilogy's larger arc, but Desperado remains the pivotal transformation because it demonstrates how a tiny independent idea can be expanded without losing its central identity. Rodriguez's career would continue into family films, science fiction, horror, action, and exploitation-inspired projects, but the filmmaker-driven philosophy remained recognizable. Recurring collaborators became part of his cinematic language. The lesson for independent filmmakers was equally important. A filmmaker did not necessarily have to abandon personal style to enter the studio system. Scale could increase while identity remained intact. That is part of Desperado's historical significance. Within 1990s action cinema, it represents a bridge between the independent film movement and studio genre filmmaking. Rodriguez's rise demonstrated that a director could emerge from an extraordinarily limited production environment and command a much larger movie without becoming anonymous. The film also mattered for Latino representation in mainstream genre cinema. Banderas became a central action figure in a major Hollywood production, while Hayek's performance helped establish her as a major talent. The film's Mexican setting and Latin cultural atmosphere were not treated as incidental details. They were part of the movie's identity. That does not make every representation automatically perfect, and the film's stylization can still be questioned, but its presence within mainstream action cinema remains significant. It also anticipated later genre hybrids that would combine action, comedy, romance, music, and exaggerated violence. Rodriguez understood that genres did not need to remain isolated. A Western could be an action movie could be a romance could exist inside a comic book fantasy. A filmmaker could use practical effects while still creating heightened spectacle. This flexibility became increasingly common, but Desperado remains a particularly energetic example of the approach. The transition from El Mariachi to Desperado is therefore historically valuable, because it shows that a larger budget does not automatically produce a less personal movie. Rodriguez expanded the canvas without surrendering the brushstroke. The question, however, is what still works today and what belongs unmistakably to the 1990s. The answer is surprisingly balanced. The action remains energetic because it is built around visual ideas, rather than only technological spectacle. Banderas's charisma remains intact because charisma does not have a release date. Hayek's performance still gives the movie warmth and vulnerability. Rodriguez's visual style remains immediately recognizable. Practical effects retain a physical quality that can be refreshing beside modern digital spectacle. The music remains central. The humor remains intentionally absurd. The movie's willingness to commit completely to its own tone is still entertaining. At the same time, some elements are unmistakably dated. The fashion, dialogue conventions, pacing, gender dynamics, and certain action movie behaviors belong to their period. Characters sometimes behave according to rules that modern audiences may recognize as genre shorthand rather than realism. The film moves quickly, but its rhythm is different from contemporary blockbusters that often use enormous digital set pieces and extended narrative structures. Desperado is more compact in its ambitions. It wants moments. It wants images. It wants memorable entrances, weapons, jokes, and confrontations. Those imperfections may actually contribute to its charm. A movie that tried to become timeless by removing every trace of its era might end up feeling anonymous. Desperado does the opposite. It proudly carries the fingerprints of the 1990s, while maintaining enough personality to survive them. That is why modern audiences can discover it, and either love its excesses or laugh at them, while still recognizing the skill underneath. The movie does not need to pretend it belongs to 2026. Its value comes partly from showing what action cinema looked and felt like when practical filmmaking, charismatic stars, and filmmaker personality occupied a different place in the industry. And that brings us to the simplest question: is Desperado actually a great film, or is it simply a great time? The answer may be that it is both, but for different reasons. Its narrative is not especially complicated. If complexity were the only measurement, The movie would not survive serious comparison with more intricate crime dramas. But complexity is not the only way a film can be memorable. Rodriguez understands rhythm. He understands visual identity. He understands that an action hero needs more than weapons. He needs presence. Banderas understands that presence instinctively. Hayek gives the movie an emotional center that keeps the romance from feeling completely decorative. The supporting cast supplies personality. The music makes the world feel culturally and emotionally specific. The action is imaginative enough that individual sequences become memories rather than simply plot mechanics. And the humor gives the film permission to be excessive without collapsing under the weight of its own seriousness. The weaknesses remain. The story can be thin. Some character development is sacrificed for momentum. Certain representations belong to an era whose genre conventions deserve examination rather than automatic celebration. The physics are impossible. The violence is intentionally excessive. But those qualities are not necessarily fatal flaws because the movie establishes its own contract with the audience. It asks us to accept the world as myth. Once we do, the question becomes whether the myth has something human inside it. It does. El Mariachi is a man trying to survive what happened to him. His guns are not merely cool props. They are evidence of transformation. Carolina is not merely the romantic subplot. She is the possibility of another identity. Butcho is not merely a villain. He is a warning about what happens when power becomes the only way to feel safe. The guitar is not merely a weaponized object. It is the memory of a life that existed before violence. That combination makes Desperado more important than its plot might suggest. If it were judged only as a revenge story, it would be familiar. If it were judged only as an action movie, it would be excessive. But as a collision of Western mythology, romance, music, comedy, violence, and personal filmmaking, it becomes something much more distinctive. For a modern viewer, it is worth watching not because every element has aged perfectly, but because the film demonstrates what happens when a director's personality becomes the organizing principle of a genre movie. It is a reminder that action cinema does not have to be complicated to be meaningful, and spectacle does not have to erase character. A reasonable verdict would place Desperado firmly among the memorable action films of the 1990s, not because it reinvented revenge stories, but because Rodriguez reinvented the way this particular revenge story could feel. And perhaps the best way to understand that achievement is to return to the object that has been sitting at the center of the movie from the beginning: the guitar. First, it seems like a reminder of who El Mariachi used to be. Then it becomes a disguise. Then it becomes a weapon. But by the end, it becomes something more complicated. It represents the fact that identity can survive transformation, even when it cannot survive unchanged. The musician is still inside the gunslinger. The man who once carried music has not disappeared completely beneath the violence. That is the deeper idea hiding beneath all the gunfire. Trauma can change what a person carries, but it does not automatically determine who that person becomes. El Mariachi cannot erase his past. He cannot return to the innocence that existed before the violence. He cannot undo the loss of his hand or the people he has lost. What he can do is decide whether the pain becomes the entire definition of his life. His journey with Carolina suggests another possibility. Love does not magically heal him, but it gives him a reason to imagine tomorrow instead of endlessly avenging yesterday. That may be why the ending feels strangely hopeful despite everything that has happened. The road remains open. The legend continues. But the human being has not completely disappeared beneath the legend. And perhaps that is why Desperado has lasted. Not because its plot is complicated. Not because its violence is realistic. Not because every joke or piece of dialogue remains untouched by time. It lasts because the movie understands something fundamental about storytelling. People remember images, but they return for characters. They remember the guitar case, the gunfights, the music, the black clothes, the impossible weapons, and the swaggering entrances. But beneath those images is a man trying to figure out what to do after the world has changed him. That is a much older story than any action movie. It is the story of rebuilding after loss. It is the story of deciding whether survival is enough. It is the story of choosing between isolation and connection. And it is the story of carrying the past without allowing the past to become the only destination. So when you look back at Desperado, it is worth looking beyond the gunfights. Look at the guitar. Look at the silence between El Mariachi and Carolina. Look at the fear behind Butcho's power. Look at the way Rodriguez turns violence into rhythm and myth into entertainment. Then ask yourself what you think the film is really saying about revenge, identity, and freedom. Maybe your favorite scene is one of the outrageous action sequences. Maybe it is the opening story that turns a stranger into a legend. Maybe it is a quiet moment between El Mariachi and Carolina. Or maybe it is simply the image of that guitar case, because few objects summarize a character so perfectly. If Desperado still works decades later, perhaps it is because the movie never asks us to choose between the myth and the human being. It gives us both. The gunslinger rides through the story like a legend, but somewhere beneath the bullets is still a musician carrying the memory of another life. And as long as that contradiction survives, the mariachi story does too, because the most enduring legends are not the ones that erase the human being,